The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is The Bible's Design and the Hypocrisy of Nations.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Created in the Image of God. We are on episode 258. And about a year ago, I met with the producer and was looking through a list of potential guests. And there was one in particular that I said, I'd really like to get this person on the show. And this was because I had done coursework through the Learning Company and the great courses on the book of Genesis. And I had another one by the same lecturer, the same professor, on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I happen to have that one right here because I'm currently working my way through all the lectures, and it's just been amazing. Well, against all odds, we were able to connect with this professor and invite him to the studio, and he's here tonight. His name is Dr. Gary Rendsburg, and he has spent his life immersed in the Hebrew Bible, its language, its literary design, and its place in the history of Israel, the wider ancient Near East, and, as we'll explore tonight to a degree, its continuing applicability to today's society. So behind the headlines of what's going on in the Middle East, you have these ancient texts, some of which we were just talking about in the studio leading up to the show. We're going to dive deep into some of these topics, but first we're going to get to know the person who has given these wonderful, on a show where we're going to be talking a lot about history. Let's look at yours a little bit, if you don't mind sharing your personal history. Where did you come from? Who were your parents? How is it that you have devoted so much of your life to the study of these ancient manuscripts?
Right. So I grew up in the U.S., as I'm sure everybody can tell from the way I speak English, but my parents were from Germany. They were Holocaust survivors. It depends on how you define that term. My mother always called herself the fortunate one. She left Germany at the age of 15 and went to England, but she did live for 6 years under the Nazis before she left in the spring of 1939. And when she called herself the fortunate one, she was referring to my father's experiences, which were much worse. He survived Auschwitz and 2 other concentration camps for 2+ years. So he had the worst of the worst. But he survived, and they had known each other as children, actually, in Germany, but were reunited in the U.S. In the 1940s after the war. And my brother and I are the product of that reunion, of course. To what extent my family experience informed who I am today? Well, we can say that about all of ourselves, whether, you had the normal birth, growth, childhood, and so on, or whether you grew up in a household where the Holocaust was a deep shadow. Nevertheless, I did not grow up in a sad environment. My parents, my aunts and uncles, everybody was just happy to be alive. I mean, that was the home in which I was raised. My cousin, who passed away early last year, older than I am, said to me, we were raised in a cocoon of love. And that really just tells us something about perhaps the Jewish spirit, that, no matter how bad things can be, and that of course and a lesson we can take from the Bible as well, there's always hope and optimism, and may we always have laughter in our lives. So that's that's sort of like a little bit core of the childhood in which Gary grew up. One day I hope to write a memoir about who I am and where I got to, who I became. And that, of course, will be an integral part of that story. But I basically grew up in a normal American childhood, notwithstanding the difference, which I always was aware of. Split childhood, the first 10 years in Maryland, and then the rest of my childhood, including formative middle school, high school years in New Jersey. And I have to say that my first love was English literature, and I went off to the University of North Carolina, somewhat oddly for a more or less Northeasterner, but there I was in Chapel Hill, majoring in English, also taking courses in journalism. I had assumed that I would be one of two things, either the next great theater critic for the New York Times, or the next great Shakespeare professor or Marlowe professor. My English major was a lot of Renaissance or Middle English and Renaissance English literature, Chaucer, Shakespeare, etc. But all the while I was taking the entirety of the Hebrew courses, sequence, and some other courses in Jewish studies. And by my senior year, decided that instead of pursuing that PhD in English, I would pursue the PhD in Hebrew studies, which I did at New York University, where I had the privilege of studying with one of the greatest, and that was Cyrus Gordon. The dates of his life were 1908 to 2001. He lived to be over 90. And I had him sort of towards the end of his career, as there were people behind me who finished their PhDs after I did. But I was amongst the cohort at the end of his career. And he just knew everything about the Bible in the ancient Near East. One of my Israeli colleagues once referred to him as Melech HaSafot, the king of the languages. He knew every single language of the Near East, Semitic and non-Semitic, which is to say Sumerian and Hittite and Greek and Latin and everything, hieroglyphic Egyptian. And I didn't master all the languages that he knew, but I certainly have done well in learning a good number of those languages.
Allow me to pause you for a moment, because in the Dead Sea Scrolls lectures, you talked about this story that an individual loved to tell about having been Mr. Green. Now,
another one of my teachers, yes.
I'm getting a vague feeling that it had something to do with this period in your life, or
right. So that person was Harry Orlinsky, who taught at Hebrew Union College, and the campuses of NYU and Hebrew Union College were right next to each other in Greenwich Village. So I knew Professor Orlinsky very well, and the famous story of the scrolls in 1954, 4 of the original Dead Sea Scrolls were still at the time owned by a man named Mar Samuel, who was a Syrian Orthodox monk, cleric, who came to North America to bolster the incipient but growing Syrian Orthodox Church in North America, located in northern New Jersey. And he put the 4 scrolls that were in his possession, that he legally owned, up for sale through an advertisement, a classified ad in the Wall Street Journal. You cannot make these stories up. Our 20-year-old students today have no idea what I mean by a classified ad, but okay, that's a different
why didn't
thing.
you put them on eBay, right?
Right, put them on. What's a classified? And in the Wall Street Journal of old publications. And my teacher, Harry Orlinsky, who was a close colleague of Cyrus Gordon, posed as Mr. Green to purchase them on behalf of the government of Israel. And that's how those 4 scrolls wound up at the Shrine of the Book pavilion of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where they still are today. And Harry Orlinsky, who had a great humor about him, I like to say every once in a while we read a verse in class. Otherwise, he was just a great raconteur of stories about how he posed as Mr. Green to obtain the 4 scrolls. So these are, I love telling these stories. And, I when I was a student in the 1970s and a young scholar in the 1980s, all of the, I hope the audience knows the expression, all of the Nephilim were still on the earth, from the great ones referred to in Genesis chapter 6, a generation of scholars that no longer exists, including Cyrus Gordon, Harry Orlinsky, and all of my teachers of my youth at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, they simply do not exist anymore. Our students will only know me, who, and I, as you introduced me, yes, I've had a successful career, but don't have the aura of the generation prior.
So along the way, you had this mentor, if you will, that you looked up to. But what was it specifically where you really sort of caught the bug, if you will? What caused that switch from English literature to Hebrew studies?
Well, I think part of it had to do with growing up in a household, which of course was in America, but was European in style, and in a bilingual household. German and English were used interchangeably in the household, especially when my grandmother lived with us. And there was just some attachment to language that I just, as a child, I mean, you could ask the question, like, why does anybody, I have a close colleague at Rutgers with whom I'm quite close in plant science. Why did he become a botanist? I mean, he had a normal suburban, he's from Britain, he had a normal suburban English London, a normal suburban London childhood. Why did he become a botanist? Well, of course, the English love their gardens. Maybe that's part of it. Why does somebody become an engineer? These are great questions that we don't always have the answers to. At what point did Isaac Stern realize he was going to be the greatest violinist in the world? I mean, it's hard to know these things, right? I mean, maybe musical talent's a little different because it surfaces in a way as a child prodigy. But did Lionel Messi know at age 17 he would become the greatest of all the international football players? I mean, it's just hard to know these things. But there I was. And I have to say, although English remains my first love and it informs all of my publications, and it actually informs the way I read the Bible philologically, we can talk about that. I have never regretted shifting at the age of 22 or whatever into Hebrew studies. I have never looked back. It's the only thing I've done for 4 decades plus, teaching at 3 different universities. And I still am energized every time I open the Bible, look at a text, look at a Dead Sea Scroll, look at a Ugaritic text. I don't know if the audience knows what Ugaritic is. It's a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew. Look at a hieroglyphic Egyptian text. I was just in Egypt in January. I absolutely still am enthusiastic about what I do. And may that be true of all of us, whatever our chosen professions are.
Well, and I think that's a great segue into our first commercial break, which is a little video actually about something that is, I think, on the horizon. I'm going to go and quickly show that. We'll talk about that briefly, and then we'll go all the way back to the book of Genesis, which is where I started learning what you had to teach. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back with more of Gary Rendsburg on Created in the Image of God.
Before there was a kingdom, there was Samuel, a prophet called by God, a nation on the edge of transformation, and the rise of Saul and David. First Samuel explores one of the Bible's most powerful stories through history, archaeology, theology, and literary insight. Journey through the lives of Hannah, Michal, Abigail, and the leaders who shaped ancient Israel during its transition from scattered tribes to monarchy. With the original Hebrew text, English translation, and accessible commentary, this book offers a deeper understanding of Scripture for modern readers. The JPS Bible Commentary, 1 Samuel.
So what is your role in that work?
Would you believe I have been working on it for 10 years? Off and on, of course. We teach, we have our full-time lives, we have our families, we have all the things we need to do in life. But I was recruited by the Jewish Publication Society, JPS, to write the volume in 2015. I look back, didn't really get started until 2016, 2017. and off and on have worked on that commentary. And actually, the video just showed the book almost 100% done. And it will be published later on, officially, calendar year 2026. You saw the glimpse, you got a glimpse of it there. The pages, the Hebrew text and the English translation are at the top of the page, maybe taking up a fourth of the page, and 3/4 of each page is my commentary. And I go through verse by verse, passage by passage, sometimes word by word. And we are looking at the Bible's greatest extended narrative. You want to come and talk about Genesis, we'll do that in a moment. But when all is said and done, the Abraham story is, 10 chapters, 11 chapters, maximally 14 chapters or something like that. Ditto for Isaac, very little. Ditto for Jacob, ditto for Joseph. There's nothing like the extended narrative of the book of Samuel, which starts with Samuel, whose life overlaps with Saul and David, and it just one flows right into the other. By the way, this commentary is only 1 Samuel. It took me 10 years. I've already started working the 2 Samuel commentary, which I don't think will take me 10 years. I'm hoping that it'll take me 5 or 6 years. But it's just been a pleasure to engage with the text. There's nothing better to engage with the text, whether it's, and I'm saying this seriously, whether it's Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or Walt Whitman or Jane Austen, whatever your favorite English text is.
Dune, the book Dune.
Pardon?
The book Dune.
Dune.
Frank Herbert, Dune. They've tried many times to turn that into a movie. They're doing a decent job now but yes. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and you just marvel. And of course, all the people I just mentioned, we know J.K. Rowling and J.R.R. Tolkien and Walt Whitman and Jane Austen. We know the names of the authors. And of course, with our biblical texts, we do not. These are literary creations of 3,000 years ago. They are anonymous. Which we can talk about if you'd like, they are the patrimony of the people of Israel. They belong to the community of people of Israel. And they're still with us 3,000 years later. And they still inform our lives. We learn lessons from them. Of course, it's in 2 Samuel, but I'll mention it. One of the great lessons, of course, you could be the greatest sinner, as David was with Bathsheba, committing adultery. And all you have to say are 2 words in Hebrew, Chatati l'Adonai, I have sinned before God. And as he says to the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel chapter 12, and God forgives your sin. I mean, there's a lesson to be had just from that alone. And of course, I will talk about that when I write the commentary of 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, the David and Bathsheba story. But, you can find all manner of, and you could take that and extrapolate back to 1 Samuel. Saul never says such words, right? He sins and he never says such words. And his kingship, of course, comes to an end, where David's continues on with his descendants on the throne for 400 years. So these are lessons we take away from reading this book, and the literary portrayal, the pathos, the strong female characters, Hannah, the mother of Samuel, Michal and Abigail, the 2 wives of David who appear in 1 Samuel. Dead white men of old. There are female characters. There are unnamed important characters. Jonathan's son of Saul, Jonathan's arms bearer, Saul's arms bearer. We don't know their names. They play roles in the story. There's just so much you could say about this amazing work of the book of Samuel. So thanks for creating and showing that little video there.
Well, and I have this blue book somewhere, a harmony of 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings. I don't know if you're familiar with that book. Got it decades ago, where just like a harmony of the Gospels trying to harmonize Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it takes those and juxtaposes the history, the chronology of those books. Read it several times, used it as a reference work. Yeah, amazing story. And I think appropriate when we then say, let's talk about Genesis, because one of the theories that you presented, which I had not heard and which resonated deeply with me, is that when David, or when the book of the law was found in the temple, that this led to some editing, some redacting, some compiling. If I get it right, it was years ago when I listened to your course on Genesis. But your approach to the Bible as literature included that perspective. Do you want to unpack that a little bit for us? Is that still your perspective on when this material was put together in the way that we have it today?
Right. Okay. So just to clarify, you were referring to the story that occurs towards the end of the book of 2 Samuel during the reign of King Josiah, 621 BCE.
Right, Josiah, yes.
When a scroll was found in the inner sanctum of the temple. The story is that Josiah issued a decree for what we would today call urban renewal or renovations or something like that. And in the course of that work, I mean, Solomon's temple was at that point 340 years old. So, it needed to be spruced up a little bit, apparently. And the high priest finds a scroll of the Torah, which we assume to be the book of Deuteronomy. I agree with that. Many scholars believe that it's actually a pious fiction and that the book of Deuteronomy was written in 621. I don't believe that at all. I think it was actually in the inner sanctum of the temple and was found. Temples in antiquity were libraries. They were repositories of texts. That's true about the Israelites, the Phoenicians, the Babylonians. It's true about everybody in the ancient world. It's still true today. I mean, the church community I invested, the Church of England, Westminster Abbey has a major library. Canterbury Cathedral has a major library, including medieval material, right, in those libraries. So this would have been true of ancient temples as well. But my view of the book of Genesis, to go back to David, and this connects the book of Samuel and the book of Genesis, my view of the book of Genesis, and we can extrapolate to the entire Torah, is that it was actually written during the time of King David and or his son Solomon. David and Solomon are the first two individuals to unite the 12 tribes. I mean, Saul before them, but he's a transitionary monarch. The first king, but it's more of a transition to monarchy. With David and Solomon, monarchy really comes into its own, and the 12 tribes are unified under a single king with a capital in Jerusalem, with a royal palace built by David, with a temple built by Solomon. And that new national entity requires a national narrative. And that, I believe, is how the book of Genesis comes to be. It is an attempt to create a unifying story. Not all Israelites in the historical reality were descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We have sufficient archaeological, historical evidence to demonstrate that the tribes were of disparate origins. No different than Americans are of disparate origins, no different than British are of disparate origins. Some are, Celtic roots, some have continental roots, Angles and Saxons and Vikings and so on. But you create a national narrative, and that is what the scribes in David's court were doing. So all 12 tribes, no matter who you were, could trace your ancestry back to Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, which in turn takes you back to his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham. And it's a bit like the American mythology, if I can use that word. Whether your ancestors were on the Mayflower or not, we create a mythic identity as if our ancestors were. And therefore, we sit down to Thanksgiving dinner. I already told you that my ancestors were not on the Mayflower, right? And yet all Americans, with some exceptions, the Native Americans are excluded from that narrative. Some African Americans are excluded from that narrative. But whether your ancestors were on the Mayflower or not, we celebrate Thanksgiving. Whether your ancestors were descended from Jacob/Israel, whether they were in Egypt, came out of Egypt or not, you celebrate the Passover, commemorating the Exodus, because everybody who was an Israelite could buy into the ethos of that story, just like Americans can buy into the ethos of Thanksgiving, whether our descendants were here in 1620, or whether our ancestors were here in 1620 or not.
So if we go all the way back to the book of Genesis, for example, then you have the creation story around 6 days and God resting on the seventh day, right? Whereas we don't really then see the Sabbath coming into play until the Israelites are arriving in the promised land, right? I mean, and at that time in the desert, God implements the Sabbath, and in the Ten Commandments, it's a central law, number 4. And
the manna story, where there's going to be a double portion of manna on Friday, so that you won't collect on Sabbath the manna, right?
Exactly. And you and I talked briefly, we didn't go into depth when we were preparing for this show, around the sign, right? It's a sign between me and you. God says, I will know who you are and you will know who I am. And this gets into the meta narrative around, let's call it our evolution. You talk a lot about, well, I shouldn't say you talk a lot. You talk about the monolatry, right? In which Israel believed in a supreme God, but coming out of the idea that there were many gods, this was like a growth process. And along the way, you have the Sabbath, which elevates God above the gods of mountains, gods of lakes, gods of territory, gods of real estate, to becoming the God of time and history.
Right. So in the ancient world, most people know, because we grew up in an American educational system, we know we'd have some idea of the Greek and Roman pantheons. But you can translate that all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt and so on, where you have a sea god. Right? So / Canaanite word for sea. So Yam becomes the god. To be equated with, if you think in those terms, Greek Poseidon, Roman Neptune. There's only one sea, the Mediterranean. Therefore, that's the sea god. There's only one sun, therefore the sun god, no matter what you call that deity, will be the sun deity, ditto for the moon, and so on. So these deities were affiliated with elements of nature. Everybody has a storm god, Baal in the Canaanite system, Marduk in the Babylonian system. I shouldn't say everybody. Egypt doesn't have a storm god because it never rains in Egypt, but okay. But everybody understands the point.
Or Southern
River
California,
gods,
for that matter.
Right, right. River gods, desert gods. So Israel broke with that tradition. And, God is not affiliated with nature. There's that wonderful story in the book of Kings where Elijah goes to Horeb equals Sinai. And, there was an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And there was a wind, but God was not in the wind. And there was a fire, but God was not in the fire. I don't know if I have those 3 in the right order there, but there they are. And those are elements of nature. God is not to be found in nature. God is not affiliated with any aspects of nature. And then there was a still small voice, which Elijah heard, and that's where he saw the divine. That's a profound theological statement. And that's what the book of Genesis is attempting to do in the first creation story. God creates all of nature. He creates all those things, the sun, the moon, the stars, the sea, the earth, the dry land, the vegetation, etc. But he is not to be associated with them. God operates in time / history. And you see this in the creation account. It's a profound theology, and it still resonates with our world today. For example, in the Babylonian creation story, when Marduk creates the world, at the very end of that story, the temple to Marduk is constructed in Babylon, and Marduk is ensconced in his temple. The place of sanctity, the place of sacredness, the place of holiness. The biblical creation story follows very similar patterning to the creation of, by Marduk, and the last thing created in the Babylonian story is humankind, ditto for the biblical story, end of Genesis chapter 1. But what follows, which spills over, it's the beginning of chapter 2. Holiness is now to be found not in a sacred space, whether it be a mountain like Mount Olympus, a natural space, or a temple like in the Babylonian story, a man-made space. Holiness is to be found in time. The seventh day of the week is Sabbath. It's now holy. God is not to be found in a physical space. As Solomon says when he dedicates the temple, the heavens and the earth cannot contain you. How, we can't even think about this house as a place that contains you. That would have been the polytheistic way of viewing what a temple was. And therefore, holiness is to be found in time. And here we are 3,000 years later with Jews still observing the Sabbath on the seventh day. Some Christians do, Seventh-day Adventists, for example. The majority Christian position, of course, is on a Sunday Sabbath. But that sets the tradition on a trajectory which still resonates down to the present day, because ancient Israelite theologians, we simply don't know their names, were thinking along the lines that I've just explained.
Well, and a big plug here for your courses through the Learning Company. I have a sun and moon on my wall here, and it always reminds me of the greater and lesser lights that God put in heaven. But I didn't know until I listened to your lecture series on the book of Genesis that the author of the story meticulously removed any reference to the name sun or moon, because these were pagan deities. And so every word is carefully picked to, whether one realizes it or not. And I'd read it, thousands of times and thought about it deeply, and never did it occur to me that one of the reasons for calling them the greater and lesser lights was to allow no doubt that there was anything but the one supreme God. And that's just one of the so many nuggets that I learned from listening to your work, which I'm so grateful for.
Well,
and
I'm so glad.
The way that you bring these things out, and the aha moments that come, sometimes I'm anticipating it, and sometimes I'm totally surprised by it. So both the Genesis courses and the Dead Sea Scrolls through the Learning Company, anyone who wants to dig deeper, you're not even getting barely a scratch off the tip of the iceberg of what Professor Rendsburg has to offer on all of these topics. So one of the areas that I have still deep questions about is the Tower of Babel story. And the reason is that the audience knows, I'm actually a Baha'i. And in the Baha'i faith, there's this figure called the Bab, and meaning gate, right? And he's called the Gate of God, Bab El, right? So it immediately brought to mind the Tower of Babel story in the city of Bab El, and then the tower that was to reach to heaven, and the confusion of the languages, because what fascinated me was this figure, the Bab, is a signal of the coming unity of mankind and eventually one language. And so it's almost like the undoing and the reversal of that thing that was not allowed, right? That God said, no, I don't like this kind of unity. So tell us what you can, just briefly, about what what scholars know about that story.
Yeah,
in particular.
A good part of the beginning of Genesis is formed by what we call etiological stories. How are things the way they are? Starting Genesis 3. Why, of all the creatures on the earth, does the snake have no legs, and why does it, walk on the ground without legs? Well, there's an explanation for that in Genesis 3, right? This incredible natural occurrence of a rainbow, right? How is that to be explained? Well, because God put a rainbow in the sky at the end of the flood story to remind Noah and all the subsequent generations that never again would, when it rains again, don't get scared. The rain will end this time, and there'll be a rainbow in the sky to remind you that the storm is over. And so these etiological stories are just built in, and one of them is these must have been ancient Israelites who were looking at the world around them, thinking about, well, why is it that we can't communicate with Babylonians and Egyptians and so on? And they came up with the idea of the Tower of Babel story. Now, that's a simplistic thing, but that's part of the story. We know from our study of Mesopotamia, by the way, we should point out that much of what I'm talking about was totally unknown until 200 years ago, right? It takes the great 19th century discoveries, archaeologists going to Egypt, going to Nineveh and other places in Iraq, including Babylon, the decipherment of hieroglyphic Egyptian, the decipherment of the cuneiform system in which the Babylonian, Assyrian dialects of Akkadian and Sumerian are written, and so on. So we now have the ability to read the Bible against the backdrop of the ancient Near East. We've recovered the historical context. We've discovered what an ancient Israelite would have known, which was probably the case for the first 1,000 or so years of Judaism, plus including the early Christian centuries. But by the Middle Ages and certainly through the Renaissance and so on, people had really no understanding of this world because everything had moved and shifted and the languages were forgotten and cities were buried and only rediscovered in the mainly 19th century. So we now know from reading Babylonian texts and excavating ziggurats that they had this concept of a ziggurat. It was a temple to the deity, and the Babylonian texts actually refer to it as with its head in the sky. It's almost as if Genesis chapter 11 is translating the Akkadian, the technical name for Babylonian, into Hebrew with its idea of a head in the sky. But of course, what does the Bible do? It transforms that story into a moral lesson, right? We cannot have the hubris to think that we can reach the heavens. The Babylonians thought they could do that, right, with the ziggurat construction. I'm sure many people have seen images of them. The various ziggurats that are still intact have been excavated or in some cases reconstructed. Many of the bricks were just lying around. They had to sort of put them back together again. And the Bible turns its head on that. No, we cannot reach the divine, right? Which is a lesson we can actually say something about as well. But that is what the story of the Tower of Babel's doing, right? We use the word tower because that's what the Hebrew word is there, migdal, but it's basically a ziggurat, right? Is what it really is. And as we now know, and it's almost as if the Israelites were saying to the people of Mesopotamia, you are wonderful engineers, you are wonderful architects, but you are lousy theologians, right? Something, right? You cannot reach the divine. And I do want to say the following, because it's important. There is a built-in contradiction. In the polytheistic systems, the gods existed in their own realm, nature, but sort of seen in the heavens in some way. And there was a great chasm between the world of the gods and the world of humans. In the Bible, and yet humans believed that they could reach the divine, notwithstanding that chasm. And individually deified, like Gilgamesh of Egypt or Prometheus in Greek mythology. The Bible is the exact opposite. There is a closeness between the divine and the human, built into the covenant concept. And yet, even though the closeness may only be this large, you cannot bridge the gap, right? God is in heaven, humans are on earth. So I like to use that as a very clear way of understanding the difference between biblical religion and the polytheistic religions of all of the neighbors which the Israelites rejected.
Wow, that's a fascinating summary. So switching gears, you mentioned in the last 200 years, everything we've learned. I just want to ask quickly about the documentary hypothesis, which you, I think, reference in some of your lectures, but be that as it may. One of my friends just brought this up, and I shared, that that this is not today universally accepted.
Right.
And I can't remember actually if it was you that went into detail on how and why, but what's your take on the good, bad, and ugly of the documentary hypothesis? What did it bring us, but what did it cost us to sort of go down that path in biblical scholarship?
So let's do a little historical background. This theory developed again in the 19th century, but I have to say it developed mainly by university professors, and I must say, especially in Germany and Europe more generally, who did not keep abreast of the discoveries happening in the Near East. They were still sort of rooted in their academic studies, and they had a Bible text, and they weren't paying attention to what was being discovered in Egypt and Mesopotamia and so on through archaeological work. The Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books are filled with contradictions. I mean, you just start out with the 2 creation accounts. They're very different, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. How many animals did Noah bring on the ark? In one verse, it says 1 pair of each kind. And then, and then in another verse, it says 7 pairs of the pure animals and 1 pair of the impure animals. And then, the names of Esau's wives. There's 2 lists. They both agree he had 3 wives and 3 fathers-in-law who were mentioned, but the lists don't cohere. This daughter is the daughter of somebody else, and the other list is the father of the other daughter or something. Okay. So these are what I call the hiccups. Right? There are differences between the legal material in Leviticus and the legal material in Deuteronomy. And just to give you one example, Leviticus mentions 5 festivals, and Deuteronomy only mentions 3 of them, including, not mentioning Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is so central to the book of Leviticus, is not mentioned at all in the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. So the theory holds that the Torah or Pentateuch is a pastiche of 4 different sources, which are called J, E, D, and P. And there was no attempt to edit out the discrepancies. A compiler or a redactor put them all together. And we have various stories about Abraham. There are 2 covenants. God twice creates a covenant with Abraham. Various things about Moses' life disagree with one another and so on. However, I'm not trying to sweep those discrepancies under the rug. To me, the whole thing adheres together holistically in a way that the documentary hypothesis devotees do not understand. And we also now know that ancient Near Eastern literature works more closely with the biblical literature, and therefore we've been able to see that this is the way storytelling existed. If you grow up reading Aristotle, as university professors in the 19th century did, you expect everything to be logical, rational, scientific, Aristotelian, and you cannot live in a world with contradictions. The people of the ancient Near East, including the people of ancient Israel, could. I don't think any ancient Israelite ever stopped to ask the question, well, wait a minute, is it this creation account or that creation account? They were both considered holy, sacred, true, whatever that means, right? And there was no unitatis. There was no single truth to be found. They're all vibrant traditions which are to be embraced. Does that answer the question about the JD?
Well, yes, because now you've raised another question, which is perhaps more important, at least to me, and that is something in the Dead Sea Scrolls lectures where you say, as you're talking about the various interpretations, I don't know if it's when you're talking about the Pesher interpretations, but you say a few times in that coursework that the text has the meaning. It means what the interpreter says it means, which is kind of a cone, right, to me. And so I love the statement, but I'd love for you to just unpack it a little bit more.
And by the way, that anticipates modern literary theory, deconstructionism, and so on by 2,000 years, where, the text being read by, I'm going to use the expression again, these, there are exceptions, there's Jane Austen, there's Mary Shelley, there's George Eliot, but most of the texts we read, right? Can I use the expression, or dead white man, right? But if you come at it through the eyes of a colonial view, or a feminist view, or an African American view, or an Afro-Caribbean view, or whatever it is, you read it very differently. And literary theory today holds that those are all perfectly good readings, even if George, even let's use, Walt Whitman didn't intend all that, right? Or Wordsworth didn't intend all that, right? So that is exactly what was happening. The Bible, especially the books of the Torah, which are canonized around the 5th century BCE, is now the sacred text, which is now subject to human interpretation. And the Essenes of the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran were interpreting it in ways which they saw as perfectly, that they were able to interpret it as they saw fit, which is to say, when Isaiah said X, or the prophet Habakkuk said X 500 years earlier, they could take it out of its historical context and say it actually means something today in the 2nd or 1st century BC, as we would say. Even meaning, right? And that resonates with the Christian position, the Christian view of interpretation. We don't call it Pesher interpretation. Pesher is this specific word used in the Dead Sea Scrolls for a style, a method or mode of interpretation. And that's what's going on in the New Testament. It's one of the linkages between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament from more or less the same time period. When, all you have to, you can just stay with Matthew chapter 1, right? When Matthew quotes Isaiah chapter 7, in Isaiah's day, in the year 700 BCE, I don't think he was thinking about somebody who would be born 700 years later. Most likely, Isaiah was thinking about King Hezekiah, with whom all the people of Judah were king to be, depending on when you get 7, considered by the Book of Kings to be the most loyal worshiper of the God of Israel since King David. But it's taken out of its historical context by the gospel writer. And of course, Matthew sees the chapter 7, Isaiah 7:14, as referring to the birth of Jesus, right? So you take it out of a historical context and, that's what the Emmanuel passage is all about, right? So this is a style of interpretation which sort of unhistoricizes, I don't know if I can use that word, right? Cuts the historical linkage, which was not normative. Most Jews have always read the Bible as trying to situate it in its historical context, but the Essenes at Qumran did not. And the gospel writers, typically, I just gave the famous example from Matthew 1, were also doing the same thing. It's one of those points of contact between Dead Sea Scrolls and New Testament writers.
Thank you so much. If I may, and obviously, I wish we had 3 hours for this show, because I find this so fascinating and so enlightening. I want to switch gears a little bit, maybe using that as a little bit of a springboard, and get into something that's perhaps a lot more personal for a moment. And I hope I'm bringing due sensitivity to this. You mentioned earlier about your upbringing and the joy in the Jewish household. And I was thinking of Fiddler on the Roof, that movie, right? That's sort of when I was much younger, watched the movie several times because we were doing a lot of Jewish things, not in the classic sense that you might have, but keeping Yom Kippur, keeping the Sabbath, keeping Passover in a Christian context, but nonetheless. And I just really loved watching that movie. And I loved how, against the backdrop of the pogroms in Russia, here's this life going on. You mentioned earlier growing up in the shadow of the Holocaust. And there's this book, which I read years ago, called Man's Search for Meaning by Richard Frankl. Victor, sorry. Yeah, I knew it wasn't Viktor Frankl. And this came to mind as we're talking about interpretation, right? So the experience of the Holocaust, he's writing about how some drew meaning from this horror and how it served them. You and I spoke briefly about respect and reverence for these texts, these manuscripts. What do you bring for it, and what does it mean for you in your life? And all this as a Jewish person, and you know, looking upward away from the text. That text says the heavens declare God's glory, right? What does all this mean for you? All this experience, the history of your grandparents and where you're at. Share a little bit on the personal level what this means for you. All of this study, all of this research, understanding.
Right. So I guess the best way to explain it is Friday afternoon in our household. We know the sun will be setting in, obviously in the winter it's earlier, in the summer it's later. We know the Sabbath is approaching. We do the traditional Jewish Friday night rituals, which are lighting the candles to inaugurate the Sabbath. We do the blessings over the wine and the bread, and we have a more festive meal than we would during the rest of the week. And there is just a calm and a repose in the household. And we are doing exactly what Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2 says. We are sanctifying time, right? There's no holy place. I mean, Jerusalem is holy, but we can live in the diaspora, we can live outside. The one thing that has kept the Jewish people together is the continuation of these traditions. And we don't travel, we don't do any business transactions, right? We take the seventh day of the week and we set it aside for our internal perspective, internal retrospection, observance, calm, repose, stay off our devices. It's a tradition that's been going on for 3,000 years, and we're still doing it. The only other communities in the world that can say that are the Hindus and the Zoroastrians. I think those are the three oldest in the world that have that. And of course, there are others. Aboriginal Australians presumably are still doing things for thousands of years as well, but we just don't have the written record. We do for the oldest Hindu and Zoroastrian material as well. And that is where we find our connection to the divine, to peoplehood, to Jewish peoplehood, sanctifying time. There's this, we don't think about it often enough. When you mentioned, Wade, you mentioned that the Sabbath is built into the Ten Commandments. It's the only ritual act in the Ten Commandments, right? Worshiping one God and not committing adultery and no murder and no theft and all those things, honoring parents. Those are not rituals. Those are hopefully human universals that we all should be doing regardless of our religious tradition. But the Sabbath is the only ritual that's built into the Ten Commandments. And in there it says, who's supposed to rest? You, your household, your children, your slaves, and your animals. It mentions the donkey and the ox. I hope you're not having your donkey carry a burden for you on the Sabbath, because you're violating the Ten Commandments. I say that with a smile, but I'm being serious. I hope you're not having your ox plow the field for you on the Sabbath, right? They get the day off as well, as do your maidservants and manservants. And this speaks to the ethos of the people of Israel and hopefully of humanity. We are all equal. During the week, we have masters and slaves and employers and employees. But on the Sabbath, everyone is equal. It's a built-in egalitarianism. There's a built-in equality. There's a built-in democracy to it. Those moral ethical statements still speak to us, and they don't disappear from they may disappear from our mindset on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but hopefully they don't. But they are enforced on Friday sunset till Saturday sunset on the Sabbath. So I have a reverence for the text that is still speaking to us as humans. as we say in Hebrew, ad hayom hazeh, down to the present day.
Well, when we, in my former fellowship, used to observe those days, we did pesher on them. We interpreted them prophetically as having future application, right? So the millennium, the 1,000 years that's mentioned in the New Testament, is the day of rest, right? 6,000 years of human history, 1,000 years. So the practice of observing Shabbat brings that front and center, and over time should deliver alignment of society, of business, around the very spiritual principles, the deep spiritual principles that you just mentioned, that are brought to the forefront while observing it. This brings to mind the last question that we have time for, where you talked about in the Dead Sea Scrolls the difference between eschatology and apocalyptic literature. And you mentioned also the Zoroastrians as having been the ones to invent, if you will, apocalyptic versus eschatological. And I think you said there are two features of that, which include a climactic battle, and I forget what the other one is. So bring us to the present day.
Built-in calendrical reckoning. Yeah,
exactly. So
right.
So the fractal pattern of the weekly Sabbath, the annual Sabbaths, and then prophetic times, the book of Daniel, the 7 times 7 punishment, which may or may not have various interpretations, 2,520 years of punishment for the Jewish people. There are all these interpretations out there. The Mayan calendar, but at some point there's a reckoning for having done or not done what was to have been done within that time period. Maybe you can just speak to our modern world and the purpose and point of eschatology and apocalyptic literature.
Right. Well, I'll say this about eschatology first, what I call general eschatology, which the first time we really get to see it is in the prophet Isaiah around the year 700 BCE. Famous passages in chapter 2, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, the world, nation, not learn war anymore. Chapter 11, which pairs up the animals that prey with the animals that are preyed upon, the lion and the lamb, and the wolf and the goat, and so on.
But what about Psalm 2? Is Psalm 2 not an early example of it?
It probably is part of that. We don't know the date of Psalm 2. I mean, it might be a little bit older, could be, right? Yeah. But it's anyway, clearer, and it's more metaphorical. Isaiah is pretty clear what he's talking about there, right? And so I would say the following, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. This is an oversimplification, but I think it works. In the ancient Near Eastern traditions, because you have gods of nature, time was cyclical. Right? You went through nature's seasons: winter, spring, summer, fall. Planting, ripening, harvesting, resowing the fields. It just goes, one continuous cycle. And there was no linear time, is the point I'm making. Israel understood time in a more linear fashion. If you have nature gods, like we mentioned earlier, you have cyclical time, because nature is cyclical. If you have a God who works through time, through history, who sanctifies time with the Sabbath day and so on, you wind up with linear time. And we start with creation, and Isaiah tells us there will be a eschaton where the world will be a better place than it is today. And that provides a hope, a positivity. Isaiah is saying all this, by the way. We didn't know that until, again, the discovery of our Assyrian material. But Isaiah is living during the time of the Assyrian Empire, which glorified warfare. They were the greatest military power the world had ever seen, and they glorified it on their palace reliefs in Nineveh, most of which are now in the British Museum, but you can find them elsewhere in other museums as well. Or we glorify peace. A nation shall not lift up sword against nation again. So that's the eschatological. And by the way, I would say that is what has kept Judaism alive. It's that hope and positivity and optimism that no matter how bad things get, you can get your temple destroyed, not once, not twice. The Romans can do this to you. The Crusaders can do this to you. The Nazis can do this to you. And yet here you are, still a vibrant, living people. Right?
Yeah,
Because there's
the
always
the
hope.
song "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." You mentioned the rainbow earlier, right? It's a Jewish song.
Yeah, thank you.
It evokes what was going on, and it puts it into metaphor.
Yeah, yeah. Now the Zoroastrians come along, and they're around the same time period. It's hard to know when to date Prophet Zoroaster, but around the same time period. We certainly know that Zoroaster lived prior to, let's say, 600 BCE, so maybe 700 or 800 or even a little bit earlier. You have a special kind of eschatology, which is the apocalyptic one, and that feeds into Dead Sea Scrolls. It feeds into the New Testament. The last book, of course, is the book of Revelations, or also called the Apocalypse, where the same holds, except there's going to be a cataclysmic battle which will destroy all the evil forces in the world to vault us into the eschaton. So whether you hold to the general eschatological view, which I prefer, I guess the peaceful person I am, or you prefer the more cataclysmic, battle that will drive out the forces of evil, we wind up in the same place, which is we'll live in a world of only goodness. And those lessons, again, I mean, these are 2,000-year-old lessons or 2,000-plus-year-old lessons, and we're still with every war. Can I wax philosophical as a 21st century person? With every war, I guess Woodrow Wilson said it after World War I, and then we had to say it again after World War II, and it doesn't look like we've progressed much further. We always hope that this is the last war, and of course, it never is. We still read those biblical passages that one world will be a better place than it is today. Amen.
The war to end all wars.
Yeah, that was Wilson's comment, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we've covered so much, and we've focused on God being a God of time, and we are out of it right now. I do want to ask the question about that upcoming Jewish Publication Society book on Samuel. Any thoughts as you approach the publication of that 10-year effort, and recommendation of what those who obtain it might learn from it?
When you, I guess it's, when you work on something for that long, I've never worked on a book project that long. And again, I want to make it clear, it's not a sustained. It's 492 pages, by the way, including the Roman numeral stuff at the front and the regular pagination for the majority of it. So it's approaching 500 pages. What I hope is that people will read the book, and you're not going to read it cover to cover, but every time you have to look up something in Samuel, hopefully you'll read the introduction and you'll read the excursus essays at the back, and every time you need to look up a passage, you'll look it up. I want them to come away with a story. I focus in on individual words. I focus in on the sounds. I focus on the alliteration, the allusions. This text is saying X and it's alluding to text Y, which might appear in the book of Judges or in the book of Genesis. And you sort of have this internal hard drive where you simply know the Bible by heart, which of course for the ancient Israelites was not the Bible. It doesn't become the Bible until centuries later when it gets canonical, but they knew their national stories and they would have known the way phrases work. This is what I hope people will come away with, a greater appreciation. Let me word it this way. The text is 3,000 years old, but I don't want you to think of it as primitive literature. It is as equally sophisticated as Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Wordsworth, Whitman, and of course, I'm only giving you the English writers whom we adore. It is that sophisticated, and through that, and again, we don't know the name of the author, but through that is teaching you the lessons We started out with the comment, when David says, Chatati l'Adonai, I have sinned before God. That's all you need to know. It's so simple, right? Saul obfuscates. Oh, I didn't know. I misunderstood. None of that. Just come out and say it. I sinned, and God will forgive. So through that literature, through that storytelling, is a deep, profound theology.
Well, and as you talk about the sort of myth making and national identity, what other nation has a king whose sins are laid bare, and not in some glorious conquest kind of way, but in an incredibly shameful situation?
I like to say that David is the only king from the ancient world whom we know of who committed adultery. I can't believe that was not. I'm sure every pharaoh, king of Babylon, king of Assyria, king of the Hittites, built his harem by committing adultery over and over again, right? I mean,
well, and then the story of Absalom, right, getting hung by his hair, and David lamenting and weeping, and it just goes on. It's on and on and on, and to me, the continuity of the themes and the fractal patterns, starting with Cain and Abel, and every sibling relationship subsequent to that, and even the name of Jacob, heel catcher, and then his life and the penalty for the trickery that he engaged in, and it's mind blowing.
It is. It's just, and by the way, we should point out, it is so human. Right? There are times in the Bible, it happens, when God wants to punish somebody for a sin, it happens instantaneously. Okay, the famous examples are Judah's first two sons in Genesis 38. You know what the firstborn son did. God saw something. I like to joke, the ancient Hebrew word, God zapped him. Okay. His brother Onan, in his case, we know what he did. He spilled his seed on the ground. That gives us the English word onanism. God zapped him. How much more wonderful it is when you read the Jacob story, right? Where Jacob's comeuppance is brought by human characters, either his father-in-law Laban or his own sons, right? They deceive him like he deceived his own father Isaac, right? I mean, this is who we are as humans, and that's what the Bible stories are doing over and over again. It's not the gods in the heavens like Greek mythology or something like that. It is we here on earth, and through those stories we gain so much. It's so human. I think that's why it has persisted for so long. We see ourselves in those stories.
Well, and I have one last question. It's a throwaway question. You don't have to answer it seriously, but as we study these ancient texts and we draw comparisons between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Noachian story and so on and so forth, it's always occurred to me that at some point prior to anything being written down, there were oral stories. And who's to say which came first and where they originated? And obviously there's scholarship that seeks to do that. But isn't it very murky? And isn't it just possible that there was revealed knowledge that spread and dispersed in different ways, and that under the stories as they're brought forward of Moses and the children of Israel and David and this righteousness, some of those stories were returned to their original state, and that what we think is derivative is actually more original?
I mean, one of the issues we have in biblical studies is that all we have is the final form of the text. Was there a precursor? Did people tell stories about Abraham or Moses or David, whoever? I'm sure they did. And we're told they exist in a poetic version. Most of the biblical storytelling is prose. Were there earlier prose versions in a more archaic,
Well, you even bring out you bring out in the Hebrew language there are no vowels, and so you've got the commandment for Moses to write it down and for Joshua to be an expert at telling the story.
and all of that informs what until it reaches our actual words on what would have been in antiquity a papyrus scroll, eventually a parchment scroll. And it's frustrating not to be able to reconstruct that, right? And I use the analogy, we know almost all the sources of Shakespeare's plays. We know the precursors to Hamlet, clearly to the histories that he wrote. We know that he based his stories on this or on that. And we have some good evidence for that. We don't have that for the Bible, right? Shakespeare had earlier 15th century and medieval documents and so on, or storytelling that he used, which were not in play form. He created plays to tell the story. We don't have that for the Bible. We just don't know where or how these stories would have come down to the writers who actually wrote them. We also don't know how or why this one little, relatively insignificant people produced the greatest literature in the time. I mean, Egypt was a much greater society, and there's some pretty good Egyptian literature, but it pales in comparison to Egyptian architecture, artwork, tomb, temple construction. Fresh in my mind, I mentioned I was there in January. The Bible, ancient Israel, there's no great artwork. There's some architecture, but nothing like Egypt, obviously. But boy, could that what?
The Apostle Paul says, "What advantage hath the Jew? Much, chiefly to them were committed the oracles of God."
Yeah. So here's a people, small, insignificant, who were able to create the greatest literature of the ancient world, and it really remains somewhat of an unanswerable question, except to say that every little society in the world has something to contribute, right? I mean, the smallest Caribbean nation or whatever it might be has some distinct trait that they contribute to the humanity of all of us. And in this case, Israel did it through storytelling, and prophecy and psalm writing and so on.
Well, and speaking of which, I have done a disservice to the audience. There have not been a ton of comments. There have been a few. I have no time, but I'm going to pull in one or two real quick here at the end.
Let's do it.
Aside from the devices, I wonder what the equivalent was 3,000 years ago. This is when you were talking about shutting off the devices on Shabbat.
No harvesting, no agricultural work, right? No agricultural work. The Torah says explicitly no sowing your fields, no harvesting, and by extension, no agricultural work. No business. We can determine that from the book of Amos, where there's a famous passage, and also Jeremiah. So there would have been a cessation of the mundane, of the profane, and the holy and the sacred would kick in on the seventh day. All right, all the things that we do on our 6 days, it would have been a day of rest, exactly as the Ten Commandments states. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about it a little differently. What was it that detracted them from God? And I thought about the little idols that some of them had. I mean, wasn't it Rachel who stole her father's gods and took them with her? So they had their own little shrines in some of their like living rooms, right, where they would not, even the Hebrews, right, and of course that was common in other societies to have the gods.
And we find in the archaeological record these little statuettes of females, which we call fertility deities or fertility idols or something. We don't really know what they did. That's in the realm of popular religion, right? Which is to say, the official religion of ancient Israel would not have countenanced all that material, but popularly people did, and of course we can see that in every religious tradition, right? I mean, there's the push and pull between the official and the pop and the folkloristic. Yeah.
You also have written of Israelian Hebrew, the language spoken in the Northern Kingdom. I didn't have time to get into that, but so that was different. And the Northern Kingdom was more quick to deviate from the official religion of the United Kingdom. Is that not true?
the video broke up there for a moment, Wade, but I will just say that like all languages in the world, there are different dialects. If you know German, Northern German versus Bavarian German or Austrian, the British Isles, the English of London and the South is sort of the national standard. But if you go to Yorkshire or Northumberland in the North, you may encounter all sorts of accents and so on. And even in America, I mean, we can recognize Boston English from Alabama English and Texas English.
Well, there's a story about the two tribes, right, where they were crossing the river and they made them say this word, and if they couldn't say it, I had a professor who said, and this was British Israelism, right? They equated the tribes with different, and supposedly Ephraim was the British people. And he said it wasn't that they couldn't pronounce it. It was that they refused to pronounce it incorrectly.
Right.
But anyway, but my question was, are there indications of the deviation of religion in that language?
You're right. No, I would say no. Well, let's say the following. The Bible, which might be biased, because the Bible comes to us from Jerusalem, which was the capital of United Israel and then the Kingdom of Judah. And that's the regional standard, sort of like London dialect becomes the standard of Britain, and the dialect of Rome and Florence becomes the standard of Italian, even though people in Venice in the north and Sicily in the south speak totally different dialect. So the typically the king is much so than the people in the northern kingdom of Israel. And in fact, 2 Kings 17 tells us that that's why theologizing, that's why the kingdom of Israel came to an end. So because of their polytheistic practices. So there is that distinction, although we have to be careful who's telling us that story. It may be borne out slightly in the archaeological record, but I think the dialectal differences are just part of every different society. I mean, it may have led to some cultural differences. I mean, people in Bavaria, not anymore necessarily, but historically were seen more as rural folk compared to the more urbane people of Berlin and Hamburg in the north. But or Yorkshire folk in the villages of Yorkshire are not quite the London urbane people working in the financial world of the city of London. So you could have had some of that as well in ancient Israel. We just don't know as much about it.
Yeah. Well, one last comment, and then I will let you go. I've kept you over time, and my apologies.
My pleasure. It's been great. Yeah.
So it's this Isaiah 46:10 from Z-Man Now. I am the God that tells you the end from the beginning. So here we are at the end of time, but what's your view on prophecy? Is it possible that the interpretation and the dating of some texts is biased because we don't want to admit that somebody could actually have received and been able to foretell the future? Or what's your personal view on the idea of prophecy being real and foretelling what is coming?
So let's make an important point here. The Hebrew word navi, the Greek word prophetus, which gives us English prophet, does not have anything to do with forecast. The person is a spokesperson for God. That's true of the Hebrew word navi. It's derived from a verb that means to speak. It's not a common verb in the Hebrew, by the way, but it means to speak. It is the common verb in Babylonia for speech, by the way, Babylonian. But many things the prophets said came to fruition, but many things they said did not come to fruition. I mean, famously, Amos says that his contemporary king, Jeroboam II, will die by the sword. Didn't happen. Jeroboam will die a peaceful life, died a peaceful death, rather. So sorry, and I know I'm now asking a question about the New Testament, but is this perhaps why Paul says prophecies fail? I don't mean, I'd have to go back and see what the context there is from Paul.
It's the love chapter, right? 1 Corinthians 13,
Yeah,
prophecies will fail, but love will prevail, kind of is the
right.
general sense of that
So,
context.
I'm not a New Testament scholar. I always have to go back and check the passages when anybody tosses a New Testament passage at
Yep.
me, and I have to do that for Paul, for Corinthians as well in this case. So all I can say is the following: the prophets exist when they exist. Let me say this in answer to the question. The fact that some of the things the prophets said, Amos being one good example, did not come to fruition is a proof that they are true prophecies, real prophecies, that the words were spoken prior to the events, which is to say nobody writing at a later time would have said Jeroboam will die by the sword,
Great point.
knowing full well that Jeroboam died peacefully, right? Jeremiah, I think, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, right? Jeremiah, which one? Says that that Nebuchadnezzar would conquer Egypt, but it didn't happen. He didn't. So, that statement is made, is discussed further on in the book. So these are just, these are the words of. Let me state it this way: whatever your personal belief is, Jewish, Christian, atheist, agnostic, other, it doesn't matter. What you need to know is that the people of Israel believed that these were the words of God. And if you join me in traveling back 2,700 years or 2,600 years for Jeremiah, you put yourself in the mindset of an ancient Israelite for whom these prophets were speaking the word of God. Whether they agreed with the words or not, they understood that these were the words of God. And I like to immerse myself in that life, regardless of my own personal opinion. I want to recreate the world of then. Maybe this should be the final comment for the evening. I live in the year 1000 BCE. I make guest appearances in the 21st century CE to do podcasts with Wade and teach a few classes at Rutgers University and write a few books. But my mind is the mind of a 3,000-year-old ancient Israelite. How's that for a way to
I love it. I appreciate you time traveling to be here this evening. Truly, what a pleasure. I will share with you one last comment, which is basically saying we need to have you back. Here we go. You'll have to have Gary back. So I will extend another invitation to you, and all the best on your travels to England to immerse yourself in that world, study those ancient texts on a sabbatical. And if somebody wanted to follow up with you and ask a question, is there a way they could do that?
We didn't have it ready to be queued, I don't think, but at any point you can email me. Just search my name, Rutgers University. My website comes up. Most of my publications are available at my website. I've got links to video lectures at my website. But you can email me, grends@rutgers.edu. I'm always responding to emails with pleasure. Thank you.
I've just put that out there. If you don't mind, I'll just air the email address. Go ahead and give that to me again.
GRENDS, so it's my initial and the first part of my surname, @rutgers.edu.
There we go. It's been sent out on all the channels. And did I get that right?
That's right.
GRENDS@rutgers.edu. Namaste. What a pleasure. So much more to talk about. Have a great trip, and we will extend an invitation for you to return to us.
With pleasure. Thank you, Wade. Thank you, everyone.
And for everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to share with you the sneak peek of upcoming episodes from next week. And as always, remember, you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. We'll see you next week. And technically challenged here. There we have it. Here is the sneak peek.
Next week on Created in the Image of God. Sunday, June 28th at 7 a.m. U.S. Central Time. Host Wade Franson interviews Jason Heinrichs, author, entrepreneur, and founder of the Wake Up Jesus People movement. He shares why he walked away from building his own kingdom to focus on building God's, from sacred habits and spiritual discipline to finding greater peace, purpose, and joy in everyday life. And then on Tuesday, June 30th at 8 p.m. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews David Truong, author, deacon, and corporate attorney. He reflects on his journey from communist Vietnam to the United States and the faith that sustained him through loss, uncertainty, and new beginnings. From escape and survival to gratitude, redemption, and discovering God's purpose through adversity. Join us live this week, Tuesday and Sunday, Created in the Image of God.